Investor Week transformed the 42nd floor into a stage. Glass walls gleamed over Manhattan's gray skyline. Assistants moved quickly but quietly. Board members clustered in tailored suits, their voices low, confident, rehearsed. Cameras followed Victoria Halle as she walked through her empire with the precision of someone who had built it from nothing and refused to let anyone forget it. She was composed, immaculate, sharp without raising her voice. When she entered her room, Mrs. Conversations shifted around her like iron filings to a magnet dot at the center of the executive lounge. Behind a marble counter framed in brushed gold, Daniel Mercer adjusted the steam wand on the espresso machine. His movements were steady, economical, no wasted motion. He wore the same neutral uniform as the other hospitality staff. Sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms, posture straight but unassuming. Victoria accepted the porcelain cup without breaking, stride in her explanation about projected growth. She took a sip, a pause. "It's fine," she said, just loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. Then her eyes drifted briefly toward the counter. "After all, just make coffee." A ripple of polite laughter spread outward. Not cruel, not kind, just aligned with power. Daniel met her gaze for a fraction of a second and inclined his head. "Of course, Miss Halle." No defensiveness, no apology, just stillness. The board resumed its movement toward the conference wing, heels clicking across polished stone. Investors murmured approval. The moment dissolved as efficiently as it had formed. But Daniel did not move right away. Above the lounge, a muted financial news channel scrolled breaking updates across the bottom of the screen. His eyes lifted, not hurriedly but with quiet focus. Numbers rolled past in green and red. Energy futures volatility, regulatory adjustments, overseas exposure adjustments. On the counter, a tablet lay half-angled beside a forgotten portfolio binder. An open spreadsheet, columns of projections, risk tolerance thresholds. He glanced once, then again. Something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible, like a muscle tightening beneath still water. A decimal point. Projected hedge stability. 80-month exposure window. His fingers paused on the edge of the counter. For half a second, the room seemed to recede. The laughter, the movement, the low hum of corporate certainty muted behind the quiet mathematics unfolding in his mind. Then it was gone. He picked up the next cup. "Next order," he said evenly. Across the floor, Victoria's voice carried through the glass corridor as she outlined acquisition confidence. "There is virtually no downside risk," she assured a board member. Daniel did not look up this time. He finished the service rush without error, without hurry. No one watching him would have guessed that something had just unsettled the symmetry of the afternoon. To them, he was infrastructure. Background, he just made coffee hours later. In a public school hallway 10 blocks away, Emma Mercer swung her backpack in gentle arcs while waiting near the entrance. Her sneakers were scuffed. Her hair was pulled into a slightly uneven ponytail she had insisted on doing herself. "My dad works in a big building," she told her friend with quiet pride. "Like really big?"
"Oh, yeah."
"You do?" friend asked. Emma didn't hesitate. He fixes big problems. The dismissal in the executive lounge had already dissolved into strategy meetings and investor briefings. But somewhere between a scrolling ticker and a misplaced decimal, something had cracked, small, precise, almost invisible, and only one person in the building seemed to have noticed. The building Daniel lived in didn't have glass walls or skyline views. It had chipped paint near the mailboxes and a radiator that knocked twice before settling into warmth. But when he unlocked the door to apartment for B, the space inside felt deliberate, small, orderly, alive. Emma sat at the kitchen table with her math workbook open, tongue pressed lightly against the corner of her mouth in concentration. A yellow lamp cast a soft circle of light over scattered pencils and a half-arrest fraction problem. "You're late," she said without looking up. "Investor Week," Daniel replied, setting his keys in the same ceramic bowl he'd used for years. "Big tour." She nodded as if she understood the architecture of corporate importance. "Did you make the fancy foam leaves again?" "2 of them," he said. "1 tulip." That earned a grin. The apartment carried traces of someone no longer there. A framed photograph above the bookshelf. A woman laughing into the wind, hair caught mid-motion. Emma had her eyes. Daniel rarely let his gaze linger too long on that frame, but he never moved it either. 3 years ago, the hospital room had been louder than any boardroom machines using instructions. The quiet collapse afterward. Daniel had returned to work 2 weeks later, wearing composure like armor. For 6 months, he functioned on precision alone. Then one afternoon, staring at a risk exposure model projected across a conference wall, he realized he could calculate market volatility but not the weight in his chest. He resigned the next morning. Colleagues called it temporary, a sabbatical, strategic repositioning. It wasn't. He liquidated bonuses, downsized his life, chose hours that ended before sunset. The espresso bar in Victoria Hale's headquarters wasn't a fall from grace. It was predictable, finite, no midnight margin calls, no 14-hour volatility swings. Coffee was honest. Water heat pressure. Results you could see. Emma flipped a page in her workbook. We're doing long division, she announced gravely. Dangerous territory. She giggled, then glanced up at him more carefully. Did anyone need you to fix something today? The question landed gently, but it carried weight. Daniel hung his coat before answering. No, he said. Then, after a beat, not really. He busied himself with dinner pasta. He steamed broccoli, measured movements. Pride was a quiet thing. It didn't shout when wounded. It just tightened. Later, when Emma brushed her teeth and negotiated 5 extra minutes of reading time, Daniel cleared the table and opened his laptop. Not to apply for jobs. Not to network. He pulled up financial journals the way some men scrolled. Sports scores. Commodity fluctuations. Regulatory updates. International hedge He read without urgency, absorbing patterns the way other people absorbed weather. Habit, not ambition. But tonight, the numbers refused to settle. Energy futures had shifted to 0.8% in under 48 hours. Minor on the surface, not catastrophic. Yet paired with aggressive offshore hedging and an 80-month projected stability window, the movement felt misaligned. He closed his eyes briefly and reconstructed what he'd glimpsed on the tablet. Decimal placement, risk tolerance, buffer, projected downside containment. If the tolerance figure was off by even a fraction, the exposure wouldn't scale linearly, it would compound. He opened a blank document and began typing from memory. Rough columns, conservative estimates. No access to internal data, just inference. Emma padded into the kitchen and socked feet. You're working, she said softly. He corrected. She leaned against his shoulder, studying the grid of numbers. Is that big people math? Something like that? She considered this. You're good at it. He hesitated. I used to be, he said. Emma frowned at the past tense but didn't argue. She kissed his cheek and returned to bed. Daniel stared at the screen long after the apartment fell quiet. He had walked away from conference rooms for a reason. Ego had nearly consumed him once. Long hours. Relentless competition. The illusion that control was the same as security. Now he controlled what he could. Rent paid on time. Dinner at 6. Homework checked. Lights out by 9. Stability over status. And yet the misaligned decimals circled back. Stubborn as a splinter, if the acquisition closed under faulty projections, the exposure wouldn't hurt executives first. It would ripple outward. Retirement accounts. Families who trusted steady growth over spectacle. He shut the laptop slowly. This isn't your responsibility, he murmured to the empty room. But responsibility had never asked permission before. Outside the city moved, with indifferent momentum. Inside apartment for B, a former quantitative risk modeler lay awake, replaying numbers that refused to balance. By morning, investor confidence would rise with the opening bell. Tension, quiet but undeniable, would begin to escalate. The boardroom carried a different kind of silence than the executive lounge. It wasn't casual or performative. It was expensive. Floor 2 ceiling windows framed the city in pale morning light. A single screen stretched across one wall, glowing with layered graphs and projections. Around the long walnut table sat board members, legal advisors, and senior executives, each with a tablet open, each prepared to nod at the appropriate moment. Daniel moved quietly along the perimeter, placing cups beside leather folders and silver pens. No one looked at him long enough to memorize his face. At the head of the table, Marcus Leland stood with practiced ease. The CFO's confidence was smoother than Victoria's, less sharp, more reassuring. He spoke in measured tones designed to make volatility sound domesticated. As you can see, Marcus said, tapping the screen, projected synergy savings will offset transitional expenditures within the first 2 quarters. A slide shifted. Quarterly risk buffers remain well within tolerance. Daniel set down a cappuccino and stepped back. His eyes drifted to the screen, not with curiosity but reflex. Years of pattern recognition activated before he could stop it. Revenue stabilization curve, integration cost, compression, offshore derivative alignment. He turned slightly, lining the numbers with the muted financial ticker he had watched the day before. Energy futures volatility had not settled. It had widened. Marcus advanced to another slide. To hedge against commodity fluctuations, we've structured an offshore derivative position tied to long-range energy stability. Conservative modeling, minimal exposure. A column of figures appeared in smaller font near the bottom right. Daniel's hand stilled on the handle of the serving tray. Projected risk, tolerance, 0.08. He blinked once. Not 0.8, 0.08. The room continued as if nothing had shifted. But in Daniel's mind, the decimal expanded like a fracture line spreading through glass. At 0.8, the hedge absorbed movement comfortably. At 0.08, the tolerance narrowed to a fraction of what Marcus was implying. Compounded over 18 months, with current volatility trends, the cushion wouldn't just thin, it would collapse. He stepped back toward the coffee station at the rear of the room. Heart steady but mind accelerating, Marcus continued. Even in a stressed scenario, downside risk remains negligible. Negligible. Daniel replayed the projection curve from memory. If volatility held above 2.5% and the tolerance remained at 0.08, the derivative exposure would breach regulatory trigger thresholds within 3 quarters. Once triggered, forced liquidity adjustments would cascade. He didn't need internal files to approximate the scale. Roughly 90 million, maybe more, depending on secondary ripple effects. He focused on breathing evenly. Steam hissed softly from the espresso machine outside the boardroom doors. Inside, pen scratched approval. Note: a board member leaned forward. And you're confident the offshore structure insulates us from domestic regulatory scrutiny? Marcus nodded. Fully compliant? Fully compliant didn't mean fully protected. Daniel slipped out during a slide transition and returned to the lounge. He wiped down the marble counter with deliberate strokes, then pulled a small notepad from his apron pocket. 18-month projected growth rate, current futures volatility. He wrote quickly, numbers forming without hesitation. We didn't have access to their proprietary model, but he didn't need it. Risk mathematics had rhythm. When one note fell out of place, the entire composition felt wrong. He recalculated conservatively, then again more aggressively. The outcome held. If the decimal on that slide reflected their internal tolerance metric, the company wasn't cushioning, risk was amplifying it. He stared at the notepad 3 years ago. He would have walked back into that boardroom without invitation. He would have requested clarification, pointed to the screen, asked for model transparency. 3 years ago, Ego would have framed it as intellectual necessity. Now he folded the paper once and slipped it back into his pocket. Not his department. His responsibility. The boardroom doors opened briefly as an assistant stepped out to retrieve additional documents. Daniel caught another fragment of conversation drifting into the hall. Closing timeline? A board member asked. Marcus replied without hesitation. If we sign today, the deal finalizes within 48 hours. 48 hours. Daniel felt the weight of that number more heavily than the financial projection. Once signed, reversal would be costly, public, damaging. Investors would respond to instability faster than to truth. Inside, Victoria's voice joined the exchange. Are there any material blind spots we haven't addressed? Marcus smiled. There is virtually zero downside risk. The phrase settled into Daniel's chest like a stone. Virtually zero. He had built a career on the understanding that nothing in markets was ever zero. Risk didn't disappear. It relocated. It waded through the glass. He watched the slide change again. Bold projections, upward arrows, clean confidence. The power imbalance felt almost physical. Inside that room sat people who controlled billions. Outside stood a man in a service uniform holding a folded scrap of paper. He could say nothing. The deal would close in 18 months or sooner. If volatility spiked, the crack would widen. Employees would absorb layoffs. Retirement portfolios would thin. Headlines would reduce nuance to blame. Or he could step forward and risk being dismissed again. This time not for coffee but for presumption. He wiped the counter once more though. It was already clean. That decimal replayed in his mind. 0.08. The boardroom door opened wider as the meeting paused for a short break. Executives filtered out in low conversation. Marcus stepped into the hallway, reviewing notes on his tablet. Daniel's pulse did not race. It settled. He stepped forward, posture straight but respectful. Mr. Leland, he said evenly. May I have a word? Marcus glanced up, faint irritation crossing his features before recognition followed. The power dynamic was immediate and Daniel understood exactly how easily this could end. Marcus barely slowed his stride. Daniel kept his tone measured. Sir, I noticed something on the derivative tolerance slide. I may be mistaken, but the projected risk figure. Marcus gave a short, amused breath. Not quite laughter. Worse, let me guess, he said, adjusting his cufflinks. You used to work in finance. Daniel didn't answer the provocation. There may be a decimal misalignment in the tolerance threshold. If that's the case, the 18-month exposure. Marcus raised a hand, polite but final. Stick to espresso, my friend. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Everything in that room has been modeled, stress-tested, audited. Marcus continued. I assure you, we're covered. He stepped past Daniel without waiting for a response. The hallway felt longer on the walk back to the lounge. Daniel resumed his place behind the counter as executives returned to the boardroom, their confidence intact. He did not attempt to interrupt again, not yet an hour later, when the meeting recessed for lunch. He approached Victoria's assistant, a woman in her 30s with immaculate posture and a schedule guarded like national security. I'd like 5 minutes with Miss Halley, Daniel said quietly. Regarding the acquisition projections, the assistant's expression shifted from polite neutrality to confusion. In what capacity? Just 5 minutes. She checked her tablet. Miss Hawley is in back-to-back sessions until close. If this concerns hospitality logistics, please coordinate with facilities. It's financial. It's had earned a sharper look. I'm sorry, she said, voice cooling. Ms. Haley doesn't take unscheduled consultations. Consultations. Daniel nodded once. Understood. He returned to the espresso machine, hands steady even as something tightened beneath his ribs. The deal would likely be signed before the week ended. 48 hours after that. Irreversible, he told himself again that he had done his part. He had mentioned it, briefly, respectfully. The dismissal had been clear. Self-protection had value. Stability had value. Emma had value. That evening, the apartment felt smaller than usual. Emma sat cross-legged on the living room rug surrounded by crayons and construction paper. "Don't look yet," she warned as Daniel loosened his tie. "I wouldn't dream of it." He washed his hands, reheated leftovers, asked about spelling tests and playground politics. Ordinary rituals. Predictable anchors. After dinner she finally held up her drawing. It was unmistakably him, though the proportions were generous. Broad shoulders, determined eyebrows, a bright red cape flowing behind a suit that looked suspiciously like his old office attire. In front of him stood a tall building with a jagged crack running through the middle. "You forgot my cape," he said gently. She rolled her eyes. "It's invisible." He studied the drawing more closely. The building was tiny stick figures inside. The crack split it almost in half. "What's happening to the building?" he asked. "It's falling," she said matter-of-factly, "but you're fixing it." "With what?" She tapped the crayon, lightning bolts shooting from his hands. "Math." Despite himself, he smiled. "You always fix what's falling," she added, as if reminding him of something obvious. The words lingered long after she ran off to brush her teeth. Daniel remained seated on the rug, the paper resting in his hands. The crayon lines were uneven, colors overlapping, carelessly childlike, certain he had stepped away from that world because it consumed him, because he had mistaken professional indispensability for personal worth, because when his wife was dying, no spreadsheet had slowed time, but this was different. This wasn't ambition, it was correction. He rose and placed the drawing carefully on the bookshelf beneath the framed photograph. The superhero version of himself stood beneath the woman he had loved, between past precision and present restraint in a quiet kitchen. He unfolded the scrap of paper from his apron pocket. The numbers stared back without emotion. He could approach this recklessly, storm into rooms, demand attention, prove competence, or he could approach it the way risk itself demanded. Strategically. Calculate it. If he confronted them publicly, pride would harden. If he presented emotion, they would dismiss it. If he challenged authority without structure, he would confirm their assumptions. He folded the paper again. Slower this time. Tomorrow, he would not argue, he would prepare. And if he stepped forward again, it would not be as a barista asking for permission, it would be as a man certain of the math. Daniel waited until Emma was asleep before opening his laptop again. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic below. He placed the notepad beside the keyboard and began reconstructing the acquisition structure from memory. No internal access. No passwords. No shortcuts. Just public filings, regulatory disclosures, quarterly reports, and the slide fragments he had absorbed in passing. He pulled the acquiring company's last 3 earnings statements, cross-referenced offshore subsidiaries, traced prior derivative positions through footnotes most investors skimmed. Patterns began to reassemble themselves with quiet obedience. He built a conservative model first, intentionally underestimating volatility. Then he layered in current oil futures. Data. Energy markets had been restless for weeks, but the hedge structure markets described assumed stabilization. That assumption was the fault line. Daniel adjusted the tolerance threshold from 0.8 to 0.08. The curve bent sharply downward. He recalculated 92 million in projected exposure under moderate volatility, 112 under stressed conditions. He leaned back slowly, not triumphant, not alarmed, just certain. This wasn't sabotage or incompetence. It was overconfidence. Someone had misplaced a decimal in a model that no one expected to be wrong. The kind of error that hides in plain sight because the people presenting it are too trusted to dote. He condensed everything into a single page. Clear headings, assumed tolerance, MISL IGNMENT. Compounded exposure range, regulatory trigger, threshold, timeline. He removed unnecessary language, no accusation, no tone, just math. At 2 a.m, he printed the page and set it beside Emma's drawing on the bookshelf. Up, crayon superhero beside a structured risk analysis. In the morning, the city woke to headlines. Overnight, a geopolitical disruption had rattled global oil markets. Futures spiked beyond projected bands, and analysts scrambled to recalibrate forecasts. Daniel read the update on his phone before leaving the apartment. The volatility that had hovered at the edge of concern was now measurable on the subway. Investors around him refreshed financial apps with tightening expressions. Words like instability and unexpected surge circulated through news alerts. By the time Daniel stepped onto the 42nd floor, the atmosphere had shifted. The calm choreography of Investor Week was strained. Assistants moved faster. Conversations were clipped. Inside a glass conference room, Marcus stood with two analysts, his composure thinner than the day before. The screen displayed live commodity data trending upward. Daniel did not slow his pace. He tied his apron, washed his hands, and began preparing the morning service. Executives entered the lounge carrying tension in their shoulders. Conversations were no longer celebratory. Temporary spike. One board member muttered, "It'll correct." Another insisted. Daniel poured espresso with the same steady hand as always. An hour later, the board reconvened. The doors closed. Voices rose inside, still controlled with sharper. Daniel wiped down the counter once, then approached Victoria's assistant again. She looked up immediately, already guarded. "Mr. Mercer, I don't have to tell Miss Halle. The exposure is now time-sensitive," he said calmly. The phrasing made a pause. "On what authority?" "On market authority," he replied evenly. "All your futures just breached the lower hedge stability band. If the tolerance metric on yesterday's slide is accurate, the derivative position will begin compounding outside projected containment." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not understanding the math, but recognizing the confidence. "I need 3 minutes," he added. "No more." Inside the boardroom, a voice rose sharply. "Marcus's. We're still within acceptable variance." The assistant glanced toward the glass doors, then back at Daniel. Something in his posture and hurried precise did not resemble desperation. She hesitated. Time was the only variable narrowing faster than volatility. 3 minutes, she said finally. "When they break." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you." He returned to the espresso machine and continued working as if nothing had changed. Through the glass, Victoria leaned forward over the table, her expression no longer composed but calculating. A red trend line on the screen angled upward with uncontrolled persistence. The market was no longer theoretical, it was moving. Daniel folded the single-page summary in half, not to conceal it but to protect it from the faint moisture in the air. When the boardroom doors opened for a brief recess, the assistant stepped inside and leaned toward Victoria. There was a brief exchange. Victoria's eyes shifted toward the lounge toward him. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply said, 3 minutes. Daniel untied his apron slowly and placed it on the counter. The private office door at the end of the corridor stood slightly ajar, and for the first time since the decimal caught his eye. The room with the real power was waiting. Victoria Halle did not offer him a seat. Her office overlooked the river, gray light reflecting off glass towers across the water. The door closed softly behind Daniel, sealing out the muted urgency of the floor. "You have 3 minutes," she said, irritation undisguised. "I'm told this is urgent." Daniel placed the folded page on her desk but did not push it toward her yet. "It is." Her gaze flicked to the paper, then back to him. "Mr. Mercer, this is highly inappropriate." "Yes," he agreed calmly. "It probably is." The lack of defensiveness stalled her momentum for half a beat. "You're concerned about our hedge structure?" she asked, tone edged with disbelief. "I'm concerned about the tolerance metric attached to it." She leaned back slightly. "Our projections were built by a team of senior analysts and audited externally." "I'm sure they were," he replied. "But the slide presented yesterday listed a projected risk tolerance of 0.08. "That's correct. If that figure is accurate," he continued evenly, "then the derivative position tied to offshore energy stabilization is operating at 1/10 the buffer your CFO described verbally." Her expression sharpened. "Explained." Daniel unfolded the page and turned it toward her. "The hedge assumes stabilization within a volatility band under 3%. Overnight, oil futures breached that band. At a tolerance of 0.8, the model absorbs fluctuation without triggering structural strain. At 0.08, the exposure compounds." She scanned the document quickly. "Compounds? How?" "Nonlinearly," he said. "The narrower the tolerance, the faster deviation accelerates loss. Over 18 months, moderate volatility creates approximately 90 million in exposure. Under current trends, that timeline compresses." She looked up sharply. "That's speculation." "It's math." Silence pressed between them. She stood and walked to the window, arms crossed. "You're telling me my CFO misplaced a decimal?" "I'm telling you the number on the slide does not match the confidence in the room." Her jaw tightened. "And you determined this from memory while serving coffee?" "Yes." The admission hung in the air, not boastful, not apologetic. She turned back toward him. "Let's assume for a moment you're right. Why would no one else have caught it?" "Because everyone trusts the model," Daniel said. "And confidence is contagious." Her eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him differently now. "You worked in risk?" "I did, and you left."
"Yeah."
"Why, the question wasn't part of the acquisition. It was sharper because I confused constant vigilance with control," he answered. "And I chose something smaller." Her gaze held his for a moment longer, searching for arrogance. She found none. "If you sign today," he said quietly, "you're not buying growth, you're buying exposure." The words did not rise. They settled. For the first time since he entered, she said nothing. The silence stretched long enough to feel consequential. Finally, She reached for her phone. Send Marcus in, she told her assistant. Minutes later, the CFO entered, composed but visibly strained from the morning's volatility reports. You wanted to see me? Victoria didn't sit. Walk me through the hedge tolerance metric. Marcus blinked once. Is within conservative range. Define conservative. He stepped closer to the desk, glancing briefly at Daniel with thinly veiled irritation. 0.08 under the offshore derivative structure. Victoria's voice remained steady. And you're confident that aligns with our verbal risk positioning? Absolutely. Daniel said nothing. Victoria slid the single-page summary across the desk. Run this. Marcus scanned it quickly, expression tightening. This is oversimplified. Run it, she repeated. He hesitated, then pulled out his tablet and began recalculating, fingers moving faster than before. He adjusted volatility inputs to current market levels. The room grew quiet except for the faint tapping on glass. Victoria watched his face rather than the screen at first. His posture remained upright, professional, mildly annoyed. Then his brow furrowed. He recalibrated. Adjusted again. His breathing shifted, subtle but unmistakable. That can't be right, he muttered under his breath. He reopened the model and traced the tolerance input field.
It was
0.08. Not 0.8. A misplaced decimal buried in a layered projection sheet. Marcus's complexion drained slightly as he recalculated undercurrent. Volatility conditions. The numbers aligned with Daniel's estimate. 91.4 million under moderate exposure. Higher if the spike sustained. Victoria did not raise her voice. How long until regulatory thresholds triggered? She asked. Marcus swallowed. If volatility holds. 2 quarters. Possibly less. And liquidity. Strained. She absorbed this without visible panic. Her authority did not fracture. It hardened. Can it be corrected before signing? Marcus hesitated. Not without restructuring the hedge. That would delay closing. How long? Minimum several weeks. The river outside continued moving, indifferent. Victoria turned to Daniel. You're certain? Yes, she nodded once. Decision forming not from ego but arithmetic. Pause. The deal, she said evenly. Marcus looked as if he might argue, then stopped. The numbers had already done that for him. Victoria reached for her phone again, convened the board. Emergency session. Immediately, the power in the room had shifted. Not dramatica, not theatrically, but undeniably. Daniel remained where he stood, hands relaxed at his sides. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded credit. He had simply refused to let a decimal pass, unchecked. As Marcus left the office to contain the fallout. Victoria's gaze lingered on Daniel a moment longer. No longer dismissive, no longer amused. The boardroom doors down the corridor began to open, and this time, the tension inside would not be theoretical. The boardroom no longer felt expansive, it felt volatile. Voices overlapped before the doors even closed. One director questioned timing, another warned about investor confidence. A third had already received 2 calls from institutional stakeholders, asking why market rumors suggested hesitation. On the screen, oil futures continued their uneasy climb. Marcus stood near the far end of the table, posture restored but expression guarded. We're dealing with a projection discrepancy, he said carefully. A minor modeling miscommunication that requires clarification before closing. Miscommunication, a board member snapped. We were told there was virtually zero downside risk. Marcus nodded. And structurally, there would have been if the tolerance input had reflected intended parameters. Intended parameters? The phrasing hovered just above accountability, so this is an analyst's typo. Someone asked. It appears, Marcus replied, that a decimal placement did not align with the verbal framing. A decimal, $90 million compressed into a punctuation mark. Outside the glass walls, assistants moved faster. Phones vibrated. Word had begun to circulate that the deal was paused, not cancelled post, but markets did not respect nuance. In the hallway, Daniel stood near the lounge, hands folded loosely in front of him. Conversations passed by without seeing him. He did not attempt to listen at the door. He didn't need to. Inside, pressure mounted. If we delay, a director warned, we signal instability. If we proceed and this surfaces later, another countered, we signal incompetence. The room turned toward Victoria. She had remained silent through most of the exchange, absorbing angles, weighing tone as much as content. Her authority had always been rooted in certainty. Certainty had shifted. Marcus cleared his throat. The core structure remained sound. The misalignment was technical. We can recalibrate quietly and proceed within days. Quietly. The word lingered. Victoria's gaze moved from face to face around the table. Investors were impatient. Reputations were fragile. Media outlets had already begun drafting narratives around aggressive acquisitions in unstable markets. She understood the cost of appearing unsure. She also understood the cost of pretending, if this becomes public. One board member pressed, who carries the error? Marcus's answer came quickly. The modeling team prepared the initial tolerance sheet. It was subtle, clean, diffused. Victoria's eyes shifted to him, not accusing, just measuring. In the hallway, Daniel remained where he was, invisible again. A barista standing near a polished counter while decisions moved billions inside a room he would never officially enter. The assistant glanced at him once, as if remembering the origin of the disruption, then looked away. Inside, silence fell, expectant. Victoria placed both palms lightly on the table. The error was mine, she said. No one spoke. We missed something, she continued evenly. That responsibility sits with leadership. Marcus turned slightly toward her. Victoria, with respect, she didn't raise her voice. If we present projections to this board, they are mine. If we fail to interrogate a model deeply enough, that is mine. The air shifted. One director leaned back slowly, another exhaled through his nose, tension redirecting. We will not close under flawed assumptions, Victoria said. We will restructure the hedge, recalibrate exposure, and communicate transparently with our investors. Delay is preferable. Too damaged. The decision was no longer about decimals, it was about integrity. Phones buzzed again. The PR team would need direction. Investor relations would draft statements. Markets would react briefly, perhaps sharply, but contained instability was survivable. Hidden instability was not. Marcus slowed his eyes to the table, absorbing the recalibration of authority. Outside, Daniel did not hear her words directly, but he saw the change when the boardroom doors opened. No celebration, no collapse, just a different weight in the room. Victoria stepped into the hallway, expression controlled but altered, not diminished, refined. For a brief second her eyes passed over him. There was no public acknowledgement, no gesture, only recognition. The midpoint had shifted, and what remained between them was no longer dismissal, but something unfinished. Victoria asked him to stay. The floor had begun stabilizing, calls routed, statements drafted, analysts reassured. When the corridor finally thinned, she stepped out of her office and gestured toward the conference room adjacent to it. This time, she closed the door and sat across from him. For a moment, she studied him without the armor of performance. "Why are you making coffee?" she asked. There was no sarcasm in it now. Daniel considered the question as if it deserved precision. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "I was leading risk modeling at my firm, 70-hour weeks, constant exposure. I thought vigilance meant control." He paused. "When she got sick, none of it mattered. Afterward, I couldn't tell the difference between urgency and ego anymore." Victoria didn't interrupt. "I left," he continued. "Downsized. Found work that ended at a reasonable hour. My daughter gets dinner at 6. I read her homework. I sleep. And you don't miss it?" she asked. "I miss the math," he said honestly. "Not the chase." Silence settled, but it wasn't strained. "You saved us from a catastrophic error," she said evenly. "That wasn't luck." "No," she nodded once. "I need someone who sees what others assume away." He didn't respond. "I'm offering you a consulting role," she continued. "Independent oversight on major risk structures. Direct access, no layers." The opportunity was substantial. Influence without ceremony. Authority without title inflation. Daniel folded his hands lightly on the table. "What does that require?" "Availability during acquisition cycles. Strategic review sessions. Discretion." He thought of Emma at the kitchen table. Of the invisible cape and crayon. "My daughter comes first," he said. Victoria's gaze sharpened slightly, not in challenge but in recalculation. "Defined first. I leave by 5 unless there's a genuine emergency. I don't travel without notice. No performative midnight crises." A faint trace of something almost amused her expression. "You negotiate well." "I structure risk," he replied. She considered the terms. In another season of her career she might have dismissed them as indulgent. Now, after a decimal had nearly rewritten her company's future, indulgence felt different. "Flexible hours," she said. "Compensation commensurate with expertise. You report directly to me." He didn't rush to accept. Re-entry into that world carried gravity, pressure, expectation. But this wasn't a return to ego. It was measured. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Part-time." Victoria extended her hand when he shook it. There was no applause, no ceremony, just mutual recognition. "You don't just make coffee," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. Outside the glass walls, the company continued adjusting to its recalibrated trajectory. Inside that room, respect replaced mockery without spectacle, without revenge. And as Daniel retrieved his apron from the counter one last time that week, the decision did not feel like a climb back to power. It felt like balance. 3 months later, the rhythm of the building would change again. 3 months later, the 42nd floor felt different, not softer, just sharper in the right places. Daniel's name now appeared on internal strategy memos beneath the title Risk Oversight Consultant. He occupied a modest glass office 2 days a week, reviewing models before they reached the boardroom. The rest of the time, he left at 5. Occasionally, dash by choice, he stepped behind the espresso bar when investor events filled the lounge. Control, this time, was intentional. Victoria approached the counter one afternoon as analysts filtered out of a recalibrated acquisition briefing. "Espresso," she said. He prepared it with the same steady precision. She took a sip, held his gaze, and allowed the smallest shift in tone. "You don't just make coffee." "No," he said quietly. That afternoon, Emma visited the office for the first time. She walked beside him with wide eyes, taking in the glass walls and city views. Victoria met them near the entrance. Instead of towering, she lowered herself, slightly to Emma's height. "I've heard you're good at math," Victoria said. Emma nodded solemnly. "So is my dad." Danya didn't correct her when they left at 5. Father and daughter walked toward the elevator hand in hand. No applause followed them. No headlines shifted. Just steady steps across polished floors. Some victories are loud. Others are precise, and the strongest ones rarely announce themselves at all.